Good morning to you all. I would say go ahead and turn to Genesis 44, but we'll probably be not spending too much time there, but that's where we'll start. To our visitors from Long Beach, California, you may remember 10 years ago, I had started a study on the genealogy of Christ. So if you still have your notes from a decade ago, we're picking up not too far from where we left off. So you haven't really missed anything. It's funny how time works that way. We're doing a study on the genealogy of Jesus as recorded in Matthew chapter 1 and also in Luke chapter 3. And we are in the middle of talking about Jacob. We've started from Adam, and we really talked about God first because Luke chapter 3 talks about God and then Adam. And so we've gone from there down to now Jacob. We're in Jacob's later life right now. And my plan today, this morning, is to kind of quickly finish up the history of Jacob. I've kind of been getting in the weeds maybe a bit more than I mean to and getting on some side details that are not super important to him specifically. So I'm going to try to keep it within the scope as much as possible. And I'm not, again, for the sake of time, not going to read all these chapters of Genesis. But what I really want to get to is, before we're done this morning, is to talk about how Jacob is portrayed later on in Scripture, later on in the Old Testament, and also later on in the New Testament, because I think there's some important points that we need to make when we're thinking about why is this the genealogy that God chooses to bring Jesus about in this way? What can we learn from this? How can we see his plan in action? And how can this confirm to us that this was not a random thing that God came up with? This was a plan he had from the beginning. And we've seen that all along the way. We see these little, I call them breadcrumbs, but they're a little bit more permanent than bread. But he's giving these little breadcrumbs, kind of hinting at, here's something to come, and I'm going to do it through this way. And then by the time we get to the New Testament, we see that come to fruition. So I do want to get to that today. So if I start going fast and you'll have a comment or a question, you go ahead and stop me, because I'm going to try to get through the last part of Genesis here rather quickly. Now, Genesis chapter 44, we've talked about how Joseph has been in Egypt. He's been elevated in Egypt to basically second in command of the kingdom, just below Pharaoh. He's been managing all the operations that has kept everyone fed because of the famine. His brothers have come back to get food because the famine's so bad. Even Canaan is being affected by this famine. So they've gone down to Egypt. He sees them. He recognizes them. They don't recognize him. They're not expecting to see him, especially not here, of all places. He should not be here as the guy in charge of Egypt. That's not what they're looking for. So they don't recognize him at all. And he, of course, he does allow them to go back, but he has Simeon, who's kept back kind of as a sort of retainer or guarantee that they're going to return and fulfill all the things that they said. And well, they had to go back because they run out of food again. And we talked about this interesting thing where Reuben says, well, he's going to go and he's going to take Benjamin to fulfill this oath. And Jacob says no. Jacob is not interested in that. And we've talked about Jacob maybe not really having the best relationship with Reuben because of what Reuben had done. I think it was with Bilhah, if I'm remembering correctly, one of his wives. And then there was also the incident at Shechem with Simeon and Levi, and they had gone and killed all the men that they were sort of trying to have negotiation with as far as their relationship. Jacob was not happy about how they had handled that. And then you have the fourth in line, Judah. Judah says, I'm going to take Benjamin and I'll guarantee his safety. And Jacob says, okay. There's something about Judah that is apparently not soured on Jacob yet, that when Judah says this, now it's okay. But not Reuben. But also by that point, they're probably a lot more desperate. So you could also factor in that. So they've gone back and they have this meal, but Joseph doesn't eat with them because Egyptians do not eat with Hebrews. There's this clear divide between the Egyptians and the Israelites, even in this time. They don't eat with them, and we've supposed maybe some of the generations later remember this story about what happened with Abraham and Pharaoh way back when. There's also this thing about their occupation being a shepherd, and that's not something that Egyptians were interested in. So there is this clear divide between them. Now, in Genesis 45, we do see that Joseph makes himself known to his brothers. And again, this is mostly following Joseph here, but if we pick up at the end of it, they return to Jacob. They have all these gifts, all these things that Joseph has sent off with them. And Jacob is told, your son Joseph is alive. Not only is he alive, but he's in Egypt, and he's in control, basically, of the operations in Egypt. He's an important official just below Pharaoh, is what we know. And Jacob, in his mind, Joseph has been dead for years. That was the story he was told. He saw the ornamental garb that they had spread blood on, as a wild animal must have got him. That's what he has been believing this whole time. And now suddenly Joseph is alive, and he's inviting everyone to go down to Egypt, and everything is ready for them. That has got to be one of the greatest shocks in anyone's lifetime. This son you think has been dead, and he's alive, and he's doing really well. So he and all of his family, Jacob and all his family, they go down to Egypt. And we know in several places it talks about that there were 70 descendants that went down to Egypt. And I think in Exodus 1 it clarifies that doesn't include Joseph because he was already there. So they have this kind of allotment that Pharaoh gives to them to settle in the area of Goshen so that they can have their flocks and live there and be fine. And Jacob is really set up in a pretty nice situation here. So we see that going on, through 45 through 46. And I want to point out something with, in Genesis 47, in the first part, verses 1 through 12. Again, I'm kind of skipping forward, so if you got anything to interrupt me on, go ahead. We see that Joseph, he has his father Jacob meet Pharaoh. There's this interesting meeting between Pharaoh and Jacob. And Pharaoh asks Jacob this very interesting question. He asks him, "How old are you?" Which is not really something that we would necessarily ask in our time. If we meet somebody for the first time, like, "Hey, how old are you?" Some people consider that kind of rude. But he asks him his age, and Jacob responds by saying, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." There's a lot of interesting stuff in that response. One is, he calls it difficult. He says he's had a hard life, and he's called it a pilgrimage, meaning he's been moving around. He hasn't really settled down. But if you take the Hebrews 11 verses talking about Abraham, he was looking for a city whose foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Maybe he's not necessarily referring to a place on earth that he's looking for, but something more than that. I wonder about that. We don't get necessarily any clarity on that specifically. But for context on this, he says he's 130. Abraham was 175 years old when he died, and Isaac was 180 years old when he died. So Jacob is several decades short of this. Now, he's not dead yet, so he's going to have a few more years, but not that long. It's going to be an additional, I believe, 17 years. So he's not going to reach that. He's going to be 147 by the time he dies. So he's going to have a shorter lifespan than his forefathers, both Abraham and Isaac, which we've talked about in the past when we talking about the flood era or the pre-flood era, how the lifespans were 700, 800, 900 years old. And then we get to Shem after the flood. He lives for 600 years old. And then immediately those generations after get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. You get 400, 200, 200, 100. They get much smaller, and see we're seeing this lifespan go down even more. And we're not going to see lifespans like this really anymore after this point, at least not specifically mentioned. We're going to get Moses, who was 120, but that's going to be probably the last one of that big a number that we see. It's going to be much smaller after that. So I think that's a really interesting thing to point out. There's also a lot of humility in that kind of answer. He's not showing himself to be greater than his forefathers. I believe someone of Jacob's age would be considered very old, and this is maybe why Pharaoh was asking him, like, how old are you exactly? But he's being very humble in this response. When we get down to Genesis 47, verses 27 through 31, we see the Israelites, they've settled in Goshen, they're thriving, they're increasing their population greatly. We see a note in verse 28 that Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for another 17 years. That's where that's mentioned, for a total of 147 before he dies. But before he dies, he makes Joseph promise that he's not going to bury him in Egypt. He wants to be buried where his forefathers are. And then we're going to see this come to fruition in later chapters here. When we get to 48, This is where Jacob is near his death, and he has Joseph bring his sons Manasseh and Ephraim to him to give him blessings, but he gives the greater blessing to Ephraim, who is the younger of the two, which that's not an uncommon thing we've seen in this family, but it would be uncommon culturally. This is not something that would have happened. You would naturally give the greater blessing to the older, but Ephraim, the younger, gets the blessing. And kind of jumping ahead in time, if you look at the history of Israel, Ephraim becomes sort of the dominant tribe in the northern kingdom. When the kingdom splits, you have the northern tribes and the two southern tribes. Oftentimes, prophets will refer to the northern tribe of the northern kingdom of Israel as the place of Ephraim or the land of Ephraim. Even though it's got more than Ephraim there, that becomes the dominant tribe in that land. So Ephraim does become much greater than Manasseh historically. In Genesis 49, Jacob calls for his sons to come to him. He gives blessings to each of his sons. Some are better than others. We're going to talk about that more later when we get to Judah. I want to save that for Judah because he'll be the next in line. Because the blessing that Jacob gives to Judah is very important. But since it applies more to Judah, I'm going to wait to talk about that until we talk about Judah. So in a couple of weeks from now, we may talk about that in more detail. But that's where that's found. Then we get to the last chapter of Genesis. Jacob has died. They go and they bury him in Canaan. In fact, if you look at verse 13, it specifically says that Jacob is buried in the cave of Machpelah. This is the tomb that Abraham had purchased as a tomb for Sarah way back when. Several people have been buried in this tomb, and he's going to be another one that is buried in this tomb. So his wish to not be buried in Egypt is fulfilled. They do take him back to bury him, and then they go back to Egypt after that trip is completed. And just one more thing, it's in Exodus chapter 1, verse 5. It again reiterates that Jacob had 70 descendants that went down to Egypt, plus Joseph and his family who were already in Egypt when he got there. So it's a pretty big family. I mean, he did have 12 sons, one daughter, so he had 13 children. But then it says he had 70 total, not including Joseph, and I assume that means not including Joseph and his sons and any family he had in Egypt. So he's probably got a few more than that. So this is not a small family. This is a big family. They've made this move. But it's going to grow exponentially. In fact, we're going to talk about that in just a second. But any comments, any thoughts about Jacob, his history, as it's told to us in Genesis? Anything else we want to point out? Good.
So Leah is also buried in the cave.
Yes.
But Rachel, of course, they expect her
Yeah, she was buried along the road. She was not buried in that tomb.
to Bethlehem.
Yeah, it's always interesting to note how these things seem to almost be too good to be true. But yeah, it is very interesting that there's no coincidences. I'll say that. It looks like very interesting coincidences, but of course God is doing these things for a purpose. Again, these little breadcrumbs for us. Go ahead.
This business with selling Joseph into slavery could have caused a huge rift in the family. And in the 50th chapter, now that Jacob has died, the other sons that had been involved in that selling of Joseph were concerned, well, Dad's died now, so there's nobody to really to protect us, and Joseph is in charge of things.
Yeah.
This could end up really badly for us. And so they go to him and ask for forgiveness for what they had done. They were very concerned about that. And I like the answer that Joseph gives, because this seems unity to the family. Verse 19, chapter 50, verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them.
And you talk about a family rift, and I know you weren't here the last couple of weeks. There already is a rift in the family. There's favoritism going on. And especially when it comes to Joseph, it's obvious they're all angry at him because he's Dad's favorite, and they make some bad decisions here, and we've talked about that too. But even before that, Joseph tells them, when you go back to Genesis 45, verse 24, when he sends them back to go get Jacob and bring the family down, he says, don't quarrel along the way. Because now they know what the truth is, and I bet he knows his brothers really well, that along the way back to Jacob, they're going to be arguing about whose fault this is and who's going to be the one to get blamed and all this. And we got to tell our father that, no, Joseph's actually alive. He says, don't argue about it. And I'm sure Joseph understood that that would be their natural inclination because he knows the family dynamics that exist. And if you take Joseph out of the mix, if you make the situation where he doesn't go down to Egypt, what's going to happen? If you assume all other variables are going to remain the same, there's going to be this great famine, and a lot of people are going to die. And I think him pointing that out, I think that's what he's implicating in the 50th chapter, that a lot of good has been done, even though they intended something very not good to happen to him. Good has been done, and this is clearly God's providence. This is God working in his ways that no person would say, yeah, this is the way that we're going to make good things happen. We're going to sell our brother into slavery, and then a bunch of people are going to be saved because of it. That doesn't logically make sense to us, but this is how God has been working, and those are some of the things we like to point out as we go. Very good. Any other comments on the history of Jacob and Genesis? All right. I'm going to move on to talking about Jacob after his lifetime. And this is something I think is really interesting to look at, is how does the Bible look at these people after the fact? What do the later generations know about them? How do they talk about them? What is their biggest or well-known quality? When we talk about Abraham, in the New Testament, it's all about his faith. Abraham, by faith, he does this, in Hebrews, but even in other places in the New Testament, it's constantly talking about Abraham's faith and his relationship with God and how that made him, not that he was necessarily a special man in any other way, but because he was a faithful man to God. So he is the great man of faith. He's the great patriarch that they refer to in the Jewish culture. Then you have Isaac, who is, of course, the son of the promise. The New Testament talks about that. Abraham had other sons. He had a son before Isaac, but that was not the son of promise that God was going to make come about. It was not the way that God, when we talk about Ishmael, this was not God's plan. His plan was through Isaac, and in no physical way should that have worked, but God makes that work. So he is the son of the promise, and the New Testament talks about that difference between those who are of the slave woman, those who are of the free woman. If you want to be on that promise, you want to be the son of the promise, you're going to have to stick with God. You're going to have to follow him with faith. And then we talk about Jacob here. What is Jacob's role? How is he looked at later in the Bible? So let's talk about that a little bit. The most common time we're going to see Jacob mentioned, and again, Israel and Jacob are somewhat interchangeable, sort of. Usually when we talk about the nation, it uses the term Israel, but not always. It will often use the term Jacob. And then sometimes when it talks about the person, it usually says Jacob, but not always. Sometimes it will say Israel, which is a little bit confusing, but it does make sense when you think about these nations, not just this one, but all nations on the earth, were named after basically a patriarch. Egypt was a person. Go back to Genesis chapter 10. It wasn't just a body of land. They decided, hey, let's name it this cool name. It was a person they named it after. It was the descendants of that person. That's where that name came from. So we see a lot of that back and forth, between Israel, Jacob. They are sort of the same thing, but contextually, sometimes it's referring to the nation very clearly, and sometimes it's referring to the man himself. But oftentimes when we see Jacob mentioned, when it's talking about him as the person in later scriptures, it's usually talking about the God of Jacob or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We see that phrase used all throughout the Old Testament. And that's usually how God will identify himself. Like when he's with Moses at the burning bush, I am the God of your forefathers. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, he would know who those people are. He's like, okay, you're the one that led Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees. You're the one that led him through Canaan. You're the one that had this son of promise. You're the one that was with our father Jacob when he was traveling around Canaan and then went down to Egypt. He knows who those people are, so he understands who this God is. That's a connection that they can understand. There are some, and this is probably more modern commentators who are clearly taking this out of context. They say, well, this is just one God of many gods, and this just happens to be the God that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob served. but then there are these other gods that other nations served, and they're also actual gods, and there's sort of this polytheistic idea and this approach to what is being said here. That's not what God is saying. God is saying, I'm basically the Almighty God, but the one that your forefathers served, speaking to the Israelites. This is something they would understand. It is not that God is just one God of many, and they're all competing for dominance. There is one God. It's this one. And all these others, they're false gods. It's very clearly said that in other scriptures. I don't understand why a lot of modern interpretations are, there's really a polytheism is really the true understanding, and this God in the Bible is just one of many. That's not what it's saying. I don't think that is an honest interpretation of that. You may see that, you may come across that if you're reading modern commentaries, so just be aware of that. I don't think any of us would have a problem with that, but it's becoming more common, so just be aware of that. We do have these mentions, and of course I'm not going to go to every scripture because there's many, but we do have these talkings of this great nation that's coming from this one man. We of course see this in Exodus chapter 1 when they're in Egypt. If you go Exodus chapter 1, you keep going down, it talks in great detail about how this nation of Jacob got larger and larger and larger, and you kind of have this transition from Jacob as the man, talking about him as being Jacob or Israel, and when you see Jacob and Israel after that, it's really more talking about his descendants. So when they say the people of Jacob or the people of Israel, it's going farther and farther away from the man and more of the nation. But we see this great growth of the people in Exodus chapter 1, which kind of kicks off the events of the Exodus. This, of course, is all God's plan. He's making this happen. But it's interesting to see that this is just not something that the Egyptians suddenly thought, suddenly we don't like these Israelites anymore. They have this great concern that we're going to be overwhelmed by them, so we need to treat them in this way, which is still not good. But there's a plan that God has here for this nation to eventually come out of Egypt and fulfill the promises that God had made to Abraham generations ago. I want to turn to, someone turn for us, because I've been talking a lot, I'll have someone else read it for us. Numbers chapter 23, verse 10. This is, for context, this is Balaam speaking. It's when he's supposed to be cursing the Israelites on behalf of the king of Moab, but he is said he's only going to say what God tells him to say. And this is what he is saying about the people of Jacob. Again, we're kind of getting into more the nation than the person, but I think it's important to see how Jacob, as his descendants, really did increase in number, and there's more that is said about this. Someone read for us Numbers chapter 23, verse 10, please.
Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number the fourth part of Israel? Let me die the death of upright, and let my end be like his.
Okay, so here, especially in the first part of this verse, we see, this is again Balaam talking, and he's prophesying. He's actually really blessing Israel as they're going through the land. And he's talking about this great multitude, the dust of, who can count the dust of Jacob? It's so much. Who can even number a fourth of it? It is so large. Now, we do get some interesting numbers of the population. It's usually talking about the number of fighting men as we go through some of this history. But we never quite get a whole number of how many people there actually were. And of course, if you're just counting the fighting men, that's a very small part of the population, because it's a certain age. First it eliminates all the women, and then you have only men of a certain age, and you can make little formulas to kind of say, well, it was probably X million amount or 10 millions amount, but we really don't know for sure. But what Balaam's point here is that this is a great multitude. This is a great nation. It's so great. There's no way you could possibly count it. Now, this is something that God had said to Abraham before, is your descendants will be like the sands on the seashore, like the stars in the sky. You'll not be able to count all of them. It's going to be so great in number, it'll be so vast when all this comes to fruition. So we kind of see Balaam speaking about a lot of the same things there as well. And since we're on the subject of Balaam, someone go to Numbers chapter 24, which is the next chapter. Someone read for us 24, verses 17 through 19. 17 through 19, please.
I see him, and now I behold him
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So this is an interesting set of verses. Again, this is Balaam prophesying, blessing Israel. This is not really the first time we see some of this language. This is used when Jacob is blessing his son Judah. We'll talk about more of that in a couple weeks when we start talking about Judah. But Balaam is giving this sort of prophecy here that we're going to have a person, a ruler, a powerful person, a powerful nation. Someone with a scepter is going to emerge from this nation. He's going to subdue Moab. He's going to subdue Edom. And there's some interesting things that we can look at in this. When we evaluate this, we know that in the time of David, when he eventually becomes king of Israel, he does conquer those lands. He does subdue them. They become tributaries to Israel. They're very much, they're weakened severely during David's time. We've actually talked about this a little bit when we talked about our study of Elijah and Elisha and how the relationship with Israel, Edom, and Moab changed and shifted over the course of that time. But when David comes to the throne, he subdues those nations, just as Balaam says. They are basically a footstool for the Israelites when that time comes. Now, I think it's also interesting some of the language that's used, and since it's so similar to Judah, obviously we're talking about royalty here, that this was going to happen. There would be a great ruler, a great dominion. But I don't think that this is necessarily limited to David when we talk about these things. There may be more of a spiritual application here. And to kind of build upon that, I want someone to go to Micah chapter 2 and read for us verses 12 through 13. Whoever gets there first. Micah chapter 2, verses 12 through 13, please.
Micah 2, 12 and 13. I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like a flock in its pastures, a noisy multitude of men. He who opens the breach goes up before them. They break through and pass the gate, going out by it. Their king passes on before them, the Lord at their head.
Okay. Does anyone know what the kind of context for Micah is at this time? So we go to the beginning of Micah. Micah is basically saying, here are some of the things that are going to happen to Samaria and Jerusalem. What's going to happen now? What does happen eventually to those kingdoms, the northern and southern kingdom? What becomes of them later on? They're taken away in captivity, and so there's this deliverance after captivity that is spoken about so often in the prophets, not just Micah. It's all over the place in all the prophets, that there's going to be a time of captivity. They're going to be subdued by a greater nation for a time, but then there's going to be a deliverance. There's going to be this return. But so often when we see that talked about, there's the physical return to Jerusalem, the physical rebuilding, but also there's so often prophecies of something that is going to last beyond the physical things, an everlasting thing. I think this is one of the examples of this, especially when we get to verse 13. It makes it very obvious. At the end it says, their king will pass through before them. Well, what king? Because did Judah ever have a king after that captivity? Not really. I mean, you have the governors that were set over them. You have people like Zerubbabel. You have these very interesting people who have they have power to a degree, but they are still under the dominion of a greater empire. You have even the Herods were technically under the Romans. Yeah, well, and that's a whole other thing. But you don't really have a king like is described here physically. You don't have one sitting on the throne of David, being like David, going out and conquering the land and defending the people. And when you go back to that former verse, in verse 12, it talks about sheep. It talks about bringing together these sheep. Well, who is often described as a shepherd in Scripture? Jesus. I think we're talking about Jesus here using the very similar language that we see back in Numbers chapter 24. We're not just talking about a physical king. When we're seeing these, again, these breadcrumbs, we're not just talking about a physical king who's going to sit on a physical throne. We're going to be talking about something that's more eternal than that. And I think we can talk about the fulfillment of that when the angel Gabriel comes to Mary, talking about the birth of Jesus. Someone go to Luke chapter 1. This is my transition to the New Testament for those who are following along. Someone go to Luke chapter 1 and read for us verses 31 through 33. Luke chapter 1, verses 31 through 33.
And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great, and will be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end.
Thank you. So, again, this is the angel Gabriel talking to Mary, talking to her about the birth of Jesus. It's going to happen in a very supernatural way. And he says of this in middle of verse 32, the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. There has not been anyone on this throne since captivity, since the Babylonians came in and destroyed pretty much everything and took them away. There's not been a king like this. And now the angel is saying to Mary, this is what your son is going to be. Now, did Jesus ever sit on a physical throne? Was he a physical king? Not on this earth, not in the way that David was. But again, we're talking about verse 33, reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end. Now, if you know history, you know that every single kingdom that has ever existed has come to an end at some point. Every country goes through those fluctuations of power. Every single one is going to end at some point, but this one will never end. We're clearly seeing when we're talking about a king coming out of Jacob, coming out of Judah, and going to last forever, we're not talking about a physical place anymore. We're talking about a city with foundations whose architect and builder is God that Abraham was looking for, as the Hebrew writer declares in chapter 11. This is also reiterated in Romans chapter 11. Someone go to Romans chapter 11 for us and read for us verses 25 through 27. Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 27, please.
Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins.
Okay, so we have couple interesting notes here. We're talking about Gentiles coming in. Now, were the Gentiles part of the promise that was given to Abraham? Were they part of that promise of that land? No, we have a new covenant here. We have something that is greater than this. And in verse 26, this is how Israel is going to be saved. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob, so away from the descendants of Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Was there ever a king on earth that could take away the sins of any other person? No. I mean, you had these great things that were done, these miracles, but you never had anyone taking away sins. Only Jesus. This can be the only person that we're talking about. So again, when you put these verses together, you see these breadcrumbs. God is making it obvious, and he's declaring it here in the New Testament. This is what we were talking about the entire time. We were talking about a king or a kingdom or a nation. We're not talking about just these people who are descended from this guy. We're talking about a plan that God put in place to give a deliverer, if you will, to take the sins of man away. That is the story of the Bible, and I've said this before. If you had to sum up the Bible in one sentence, it's God's plan to reconcile man to him. That's what it is. That's the story of the Bible. So go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
When the Israelites went away into captivity, Jeremiah 3, God says that I put her away, talking about the 10 northern tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And I which included the Gentiles. On one occasion, Jesus said, I have other sheep that are not a part of this fold. I will bring them here so that we can be together, one fold. And that's talking about the Gentiles.
Yeah.
So even this is talking about a spiritual king over a spiritual people, a spiritual Israel. And so, yes, they carry Jacob's name, but it is a spiritual connotation, not the biological connection to Abraham.
Yeah, and when it talks about Abraham in the New Testament over and over, it says, if you want to claim Abraham as your father, you better be like your father, saying you need to have the faith of Abraham. And Jesus says of the people of his time, you're following your father Satan, is what he's saying. You're not acting like your physical father, you're acting like your spiritual father. But later writings of Paul talk about Abraham's faith. You want to be part of that promise? Have faith like Abraham. He's not talking about bloodline anymore. He's talking about those who will accept and serve in the way that Abraham did. And it's exactly the same point.
John, in Matthew 3, said that God is able to make children of Abraham out of these stones. Okay, God can do that. God cannot make spiritual Israel, because that takes a choice that each person makes of a free will to commit to the covenant that God has offered.
Yeah, and again, that goes to the point of Abraham is, why was Abraham so great? Not because of who he came from or who he was on the earth, but because he was faithful to God. That's what sets him apart all throughout his life. That's what sets him apart in the New Testament, is his faithfulness to God. Another thing, we're running out of time, but I'm going to want to finish these. Or at least I'm going to talk about them, and we might not read the whole thing. Go to John chapter 4. I'm just going to skim through this real quick. This is the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. This is probably a pretty well-known set of verses, but I want to look at this in a little different way. When you look at verses, especially 5 through 14, it talks about this story, and Jesus goes to this certain place, and it talks about Jacob's well is there in verse 6. Jacob's well is there, and the Samaritan woman meets him there. Of course, they have their conversation, and she says to him in verse 11, she says, "Sir," the woman said, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water?" Jesus has told her about living water, and she doesn't really quite understand at this point. Verse 12, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his flocks and herds?" This is an interesting question. Are you greater than our father Jacob? Now, we kind of look at this and like, well, we know the answer to this. She doesn't yet, but this is a really interesting question. She has this admiration for this forefather of theirs. They understand what he has done. They're at his well, and she's saying, well, you've got nothing to draw with. Where's this living water? Now, who do you think you are, in a way? Can you even be greater than our father Jacob? And here's his answer. Jesus answered, this is verse 13, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again," speaking of the water from the well of Jacob. "But whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him the spring of water welling up to eternal life." Of course, the conversation goes on, but here's his answer to, are you greater than our forefather Jacob? He says, yes, in a long way. This water, you can drink it. It'll quench you for a little bit, but you're going to be thirsty again. I'm going to give you something that will never go away. It's an eternal thing. Yes, I'm greater than our forefather Jacob. Now, of course, we understand this to be like, yeah, well, of course. But this is something that the people of Jesus' time didn't quite understand. They had this reverence for their forefathers. They knew what they had done, and they didn't quite understand. There's other conversations where people say, are you so much greater than our forefather Abraham? What do you know about Abraham? And he says, well, before Abraham was, I am. And they don't like that. They try to kill him over that answer because it's showing that he has a greater, he is greater than Abraham. That's the simple way of putting it. And then also, of course, if you look at the book of Hebrews over and over, this is the point that the writer of Hebrews is making through several of the first chapters. Jesus is greater than Moses because, Moses brought the law, but Jesus is bringing the better covenant. He's superior to the angels. Angels don't have their own authority, despite their power. Jesus has even greater than that. Jesus is greater than Abraham. Jesus is greater than, he is the perfect sacrifice. He's greater than all the sacrifices that have been brought because his is done once for all people, not just this putting off of sin that the blood of goats and bulls can never really quite take care of. Jesus took care of it, and that's really what a lot of the Hebrew writer is saying. Which, if you go to of course, Hebrews chapter 11, we get mentions of Jacob there. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9, he's living in tents like a wanderer, like Isaac and Abraham were. In verse 20, is where we see that by faith Isaac gave his blessings to Esau and Jacob. Of course, we know that Jacob got the greater blessing. This is part of God's plan. And in the next verse, verse 21 of chapter 11 in Hebrews, Jacob blesses Joseph's sons at the end of his life, Ephraim and Manasseh. We've talked about that this morning, and talks about him worshiping while he's leaning on his staff, that even in his old age, he is worshiping God. He is giving thanks to God. There's one more verse I want to go to before we close. I know we're out of time, but I'm going to fight time. Let's go to Romans chapter 9 real quick. Someone read for us. No, it's too long. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll mention it, and then maybe you all can read it this afternoon when you get time. Romans chapter 9 really tells us about God's plan and purpose. If you read Romans chapter 9 verses, it's basically 9 through 29, those verses, talks about a lot of what God does and how he operates in our lives. Kind of going again to this idea of, how could these great things come from terrible situations. If you go down to, I'm trying to just pick a small part of this. Let's look at verse. I'm going to begin. See, this is hard. Verse 11. It's talking. Well, let's go to verse 10. Not only that, but it's talking about the history here. But Rebekah's children had one and the same father, our father Isaac, yet before the twins were born or done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What shall we say? Is God unjust? Not at all, for he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. It does not therefore depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed on the earth. Therefore God has mercy on those he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden. It goes on. There's kind of more of this, but for the sake of time, I'm going to cut it there. God had made decisions on how he was going to work his plan. And this is a lot what Romans chapter 9 is talking about. We look at things, we're like, well, why is God doing it this way? Or how could this possibly be done this way? This is not the way we would have done it. And that's oftentimes what we think of in our life. This is not how I would have done it, God. Why are you doing this? Because we have this scope. This is all we can see. And we don't see all the other things that are going on in space and time. And God talks about how, he's going to give mercy according to his plan. He's going to, for those who are going to harden their hearts, he's going to work with that in that way. There's more I probably would want to say about this, but that's the simpleness of it. But of course, we have Jacob mentioned there. That's why I'm bringing this up. But we see all these nobodies, if you will: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They have wealth to an extent. They have grand flocks, big families, eventually, but they're not really anybody important except that they served God. They were faithful to God, and God made promises to them, and through them, he said to Abraham, all nations of the earth are going to be blessed, not just your descendants, but because of one who comes through your seed. And of course, that's really a reference to Christ, and that's kind of the point of this study, is that all these things are pointing forward to Christ. So when we get to Matthew chapter 1, we get to Luke chapter 3, this should not be a surprise to anyone who's been paying attention. And that's kind of the sad thing about when Jesus is on the scene and he's teaching and he's doing these miracles. So many they miss it, or they intentionally blind themselves to it because they're afraid of what may happen to them. The Pharisees are talked about many times. They know really what Jesus is talking about, but they're afraid of, well, what's this Jesus guy going to do to our position? What's Rome going to do? And they blind themselves to the truth, which is really not something we want to do in our own lives. We want to be very careful about that. I'm going to stop there. We're way out of time, but I did want to finish through Jacob. Any final comments, questions, thoughts before we close this morning? Okay. Next week, I'm not going to be here. My understanding is we'll have a guest speaker here to take over the class in the morning next week. So you'll have plenty of time to read up on Judah. You got 2 weeks, and we'll pick up Judah in 2 weeks. We'll start talking about Judah and him in Genesis. It's not as much as Jacob, but there are some interesting things that we skipped when we were talking about Jacob that I want to go back to and kind of bring up more